The evening air in Vienna carried that special kind of crispness that only comes in early autumn. Cool enough to make you pull your coat a little tighter, but still soft with the lingering warmth of summer. Inside the Palais Lobkowitz, however, the atmosphere was anything but cool. The grand ballroom buzzed with energy, laughter, and the gentle clinking of fine crystal. Crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings painted with golden swirls, their light bouncing off mirrors and gilded frames that had witnessed centuries of music, politics, and whispered secrets. This wasn't just any event. It was one of the most anticipated charity galas of the season, organized to raise funds for music programs in schools that had long since lost their arts budgets. And tonight, the guest of honor was one of the most celebrated pianists in the world. He didn't need an introduction. His face had graced magazine covers, his recordings filled concert halls, and his name alone could sell out tickets months in advance. Dressed in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, he moved through the crowd with the ease of someone who'd spent a lifetime being admired. He shook hands, accepted compliments with a modest nod, and exchanged witty remarks with diplomats and donors alike. But beneath the charm was a quiet confidence, some might even call it arrogance, that came from years of being told he was exceptional. And in many ways he was. His fingers could make a piano sing like few others. Yet, like many who live at the top of their field, he'd begun to forget what it felt like to be unseen, underestimated, or overlooked. Near the back of the room, far from the center of attention, stood a woman who knew that feeling all too well. She wasn't here for fame or recognition. In fact, she'd almost not come at all. Her flight had been delayed, her suitcase had been lost and later found, thankfully, and she'd spent the morning rushing across the city with a map in one hand and a crumpled train ticket in the other. She wore a simple navy dress she'd bought secondhand, the kind that didn't draw eyes but held up well through long days. Her shoes were comfortable, not stylish, practical for standing, for walking, for teaching. Because that's what she did. She taught piano, not in grand conservatories or elite academies, but in a small community center in a part of the city where music was a luxury most families couldn't afford. She'd come to Vienna for one reason only: to support one of her students, a quiet boy with big ears and even bigger dreams, who'd just been awarded a full scholarship to a prestigious music school here. She'd scraped together every euro she could, canceling her own small vacation, skipping meals, even selling some of her older sheet music to buy a one-way ticket. She'd told no one back home. She didn't want pity or praise. She just wanted to be there when he walked into that school for the first time, to give him a reassuring smile and maybe a small gift, a new metronome wrapped in brown paper. The gala ticket had been a surprise gift from the boy's new mentor, a retired conductor who'd been moved by the child's raw talent and the teacher's quiet dedication. She'd accepted it gratefully but nervously. She didn't belong in rooms like this, rooms filled with people who spoke 3 languages, wore designer clothes, and discussed wine vintages like they were poetry. She preferred the sound of children practicing scales, the smell of old piano wood, and the satisfaction of watching a struggling student finally nail a difficult passage. Now, standing near a marble column, she held a small glass of sparkling water. She didn't drink alcohol, not out of principle, but because she never wanted to dull her ears and watch the piano. It sat on a raised platform near the stage, a magnificent Steinway, polished to a mirror shine, its lid open like an invitation. To her, it wasn't just an instrument. It was a voice, a companion, a place where joy, grief, hope, and memory could all live in the space between notes. She remembered the first time she'd touched a real piano. She'd been 6 years old, peeking through the window of a neighbor's house where an old woman gave lessons. One rainy afternoon, the woman had seen her and beckoned her inside. "Go on," she'd said, patting the bench. "Try it." That moment had changed everything. The keys were cool under her small fingers, and even her clumsy attempt at Twinkle Twinkle had felt like magic. From that day on, she'd practiced anywhere she could, on broken keyboards, on tabletops, even on drawn-out chalk keys on the sidewalk. Music became her escape, her language, her lifeline. Years later, after studying at a modest conservatory and winning a few local competitions, she'd been offered a chance to tour Europe as a soloist. But she'd turned it down. Not because she didn't love performing, she did, but because she'd seen how many children in her neighborhood had never even heard a live piano. She chose to stay, to teach, to plant seeds she might never see bloom. and she'd never regretted it. Not once. Back in the ballroom, the famous pianist noticed her. Not because she was loud or flashy, she was the opposite, but because of the way she stood. While others posed, chatted, or checked their phones, she was still. Completely still. Her eyes never left the piano. There was a kind of reverence in her gaze, a depth of feeling that stood out in a room full of surface-level charm. He turned to his friend, a well-known music journalist who'd written glowing reviews of his work for years. "See that woman by the column?" he said, voice low but amused. "She's staring at the piano like it's her long-lost lover." They both chuckled. Then, emboldened by the wine and the easy laughter of his circle, he raised his voice just enough to carry, "Hey, since you're so taken with it, why don't you give it a go? Play us something while I grab a drink." It wasn't meant to be cruel. In his world, this kind of playful challenge was common, lighthearted, even flattering. But it landed differently than he expected. A few nearby guests turned. Some smiled. Others looked slightly uncomfortable. The comment hung in the air, not quite a joke, not quite an insult, but definitely a test. The woman didn't react right away. She didn't flinch or look away. Instead, she set her glass down carefully on a nearby table, smoothed her dress, and began walking toward the piano. Her steps were calm, unhurried. There was no showiness in her movement, just quiet purpose. The room seemed to sense a shift. Conversation slowed. The string quartet in the corner paused between pieces. Even the waiter stopped mid-pour. All eyes followed her as she reached the grand piano, ran her hand gently over its glossy surface like greeting an old friend, and sat on the bench. She adjusted the bench height, tested the pedals with her foot, and took a slow, deep breath. For a moment, nothing happened. Just silence. Then her fingers touched the keys. What came next stunned everyone. She began with the opening chords of Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor, a piece known for its emotional depth, its thunderous bass lines, and its haunting melody. It's not an easy piece. It demands power, control, and soul. And she had all three. Her playing wasn't flashy. It wasn't about speed or showy technique. It was about feeling. Every note had weight. Every pause spoke. The low notes rumbled like distant storms, while the high notes shimmered like tears in moonlight. She didn't just play the music, she lived it. You could hear the years of practice, the late nights, the sacrifices, the love. It wasn't performance. It was truth. The famous pianist who'd been walking toward the bar froze. His glass halfway to his lips, he turned slowly, eyes wide. His playful smirk vanished, replaced by something far more complex. Surprise, yes, but also recognition. This wasn't amateur playing. This was artistry of the highest order. Around the room, people stood still. A woman dropped her napkin without noticing. An older man closed his eyes and leaned forward, as if trying to absorb every vibration. Even the staff stopped moving. The only sound was the piano, rich, powerful, and utterly alive. As the music built toward its climax, the tension in the room became almost physical. You could feel it in your chest, and when she reached the final chords, those deep, resonant notes that seemed to echo in your bones, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of awe, full of respect, full of something words couldn't quite capture. For 3 full seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. Then, as if released from a spell, the room erupted. Applause burst forth. Not the polite clapping you give out of courtesy, but real, heartfelt, standing ovation-worthy applause. People cheered. Someone whistled. A few wiped their eyes. The woman rose from the bench, gave a small, humble nod, no bow, no grand gesture, and stepped back. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The music had said everything. The famous pianist didn't clap right away. He just stared at her, his expression unreadable. In that moment, the roles had reversed. The one who'd issued the joke now stood humbled. The one who'd been dismissed as a nobody had just reminded everyone what music was really about. Not fame, not perfection, but heart. And as the applause continued, echoing off the gilded walls of the centuries-old palace, something shifted in the room. It wasn't just about a surprise performance anymore. It was about seeing someone truly and realizing how often we mistake silence for insignificance. The woman walked back toward the column, picked up her glass of water, and took a small sip. Her hands trembled slightly, not from nerves, but from the rush of emotion. She hadn't played for an audience like this in years, but she hadn't played for them either. She'd played for the music, for the boy who'd inspired her trip, for every child who'd ever been told they were not good enough for the world of classical music. And somewhere in the crowd, that boy stood, eyes wide with pride, clutching his new sheet music like a treasure. He'd seen his teacher do something extraordinary, but to him it wasn't surprising. He'd always known she was magic. The gala would go on. Speeches would be made, checks would be written, and the famous pianist would eventually take the stage for his scheduled encore. But nothing would be quite the same after those few minutes at the piano, because sometimes the most powerful moments come not from the spotlight, but from the quiet corners where someone you never expected steps forward, sits down, and reminds the world what it means to truly listen. The applause didn't fade quickly. It rolled through the ballroom like a wave, rising and falling, refusing to be ignored. People kept clapping, some even calling out bravo or encore, not because they expected more, but because they didn't know how else to respond to what they'd just witnessed. It wasn't just that the playing had been good. It was that it had felt real. In a room full of polished surfaces and practiced smiles, her performance had been raw, honest, and deeply human. And that kind of truth always leaves a mark. She stood near the piano, hands folded in front of her, eyes lowered. She wasn't used to attention like this. Back home, praise came in quiet nods from students, in a parent's grateful thank you, or in the rare moment when a child finally played a piece all the way through without stopping. This storm of admiration was overwhelming. She didn't smile right away, not because she wasn't moved, but because she was still inside the music, still feeling the echo of those last chords in her bones. Across the room, the famous pianist finally moved. He set his drink down on a passing tray, straightened his jacket, and walked slowly toward the piano. His earlier swagger was gone. In its place was something quieter, curiosity, maybe even humility. He stopped a few feet away from her, hands in his pockets, and studied her not like a rival but like someone trying to solve a puzzle he hadn't known existed. "That was remarkable," he said, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier playfulness. "Rachmaninoff's C-sharp minor isn't something you just pick up on a whim. You've studied deeply." She looked up at him then, meeting his eyes for the first time. There was no anger in her gaze, no resentment for the earlier comment, just calm. "I've played it since I was 16, she said simply. "It's part of me." He nodded slowly, as if that explained everything, and in a way it did. Music like that doesn't come from practice alone. It comes from living with a piece so long that it becomes part of your breath, your heartbeat, your story. A small crowd had gathered around them now, not intrusively, but with genuine interest. A few guests whispered to each other. One woman pulled out her phone, not to record, but to text someone. "You won't believe what just happened." The boy, the student she'd come to support, stood a few steps behind her, eyes wide with pride, clutching his sheet music like a shield and a trophy all at once. The pianist glanced at the boy, then back at her. "You teach, don't you?" "I do," she said. "Mostly children, some adults who never had the chance when they were young." "And you came here for him?" He nodded toward the boy. She smiled then, softly, warmly. "Yes, he earned this. I just wanted to be here when it began." Something in her words seemed to settle deep inside him. He'd spent years chasing perfection, accolades, sold-out halls. But here was someone who gave her talent away, day after day, lesson after lesson, without expecting anything in return. And yet, in that single performance, she'd shown a depth of musical understanding that rivaled anything he'd heard in concert halls across the world. He hesitated, then said, "Would you play something else? Just for us? Not because I'm asking as a favor, but because I'd like to hear how you interpret another piece." A murmur of agreement rippled through the onlookers. But she shook her head gently. "I shouldn't, I wasn't prepared. And this isn't my stage." But the pianist wasn't ready to let it go, not yet. There was a challenge forming in his mind. Not a cruel one, but the kind musicians sometimes use to test each other, to learn, to grow. He'd spent his life surrounded by people who told him he was the best. But music isn't about being the best. It's about connection. And right now he felt something he hadn't in a long time, the urge to truly listen, and maybe to be heard in return. "How about this?" he said, stepping closer to the piano. "Let's make it a little friendly exchange. We both play the same piece, something demanding, something that shows not just fingers but feeling. Chopin's Winter Wind Etude, Opus 25, number 11, you know it? She did. Everyone who'd studied piano seriously knew it. It's one of Chopin's most difficult etudes, a swirling storm of arpeggios, rapid left-hand runs, and a melody that must sing through the chaos. It's often used to separate the technically skilled from the truly expressive. She didn't answer right away. She looked at the boy, who gave her the tiniest nod, his way of saying, "You can do this." Then she looked at the piano, as if asking its permission. Finally she said, "All right, but only if you go first." A small smile touched the pianist's lips. Fair enough. He sat at the bench, adjusted it with practiced ease, and placed his hands over the keys. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence was different, charged with anticipation, not just curiosity. He took a breath and began. His playing was, as expected, flawless. Every note was precise. The tempo was perfect. The arpeggios cascaded like icy rain, clean and controlled. He navigated the treacherous passages with the ease of someone who'd mastered them long ago. There was power in his performance and elegance. But to those who listened closely, really listened, something was missing. It was like watching a perfectly painted landscape that had no wind, no birds, no life beyond the frame. Beautiful, yes, but distant. When he finished, he stood and stepped back without fanfare. No bow, no flourish, just a quiet, "Your turn." She walked to the piano again, slower this time, as if carrying something fragile. She sat, closed her eyes for a moment, and let her hands rest lightly on the keys. Then she began. From the very first note, it was clear this would be different. Where his version had been precise, hers was alive. The left hand didn't just play the arpeggios, it made them breathe. They rose and fell like waves, sometimes urgent, sometimes sorrowful. And through that storm the melody emerged, not shouted, not forced, but whispered, like a secret the piano was sharing only with those willing to lean in and listen. Her fingers moved with a kind of effortless intensity. There was no strain, no show of effort, just pure connection between thought, touch, and sound. In the fast passages, she didn't just race through. She shaped each phrase, gave each note a purpose. And in the quiet moments, the brief rests between storms, she let the silence speak as loudly as the music. Halfway through, the famous pianist leaned against a nearby pillar, arms crossed, eyes closed. He wasn't watching her hands anymore. He was listening with his whole body. And what he heard shook him, not because she was better, though many in the room would later say she was, but because she played like someone who knew what music was for. Not to impress, not to win, but to heal, to remember, to say the things words never could. When she reached the final bars, the music didn't just end, it dissolved, like mist at sunrise. The last notes hung in the air, trembling before fading into silence. This time, no one clapped right away. They couldn't. They were still inside the feeling. Then, one by one, people began to stand, not because it was expected, but because they needed to show respect in the only way they knew how. The boy was crying quietly, tears rolling down his cheeks, but he was smiling. An elderly woman in the front dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Even the waiters, who'd seen countless performances at this venue, stood still, trays forgotten. The pianist didn't move for a long moment. Then he walked over to her, not with the air of a competitor, but with the quiet reverence one artist gives another. He extended his hand. "I owe you an apology," he said, voice low enough that only she could hear. "I made an assumption, and I was wrong." She took his hand, not with triumph, but with grace. "We all make assumptions," she said. "What matters is what we do after." He nodded, then turned to the crowd, which had fallen silent again, waiting. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice stronger now, filled with something new, humility, maybe even wonder. "Tonight, we were lucky enough to witness something rare. Not just great playing, but great soul. This woman didn't come here to perform. She came here for someone else. And yet she gave us all a gift." The room erupted again, louder this time, deeper, but she didn't bask in it. She simply stepped back, gestured toward the boy, and said, "He's the reason I'm here. He's the future." Later, as the gala resumed, speeches began, canapes circulated, champagne flowed again. People kept glancing toward the piano, as if it might speak again on its own. The famous pianist stayed close to her, asking quiet questions. Where did she study? How long had she taught? Did she ever perform publicly? She answered simply, without embellishment. She spoke of her students like they were her own children, proud of their small victories, patient with their struggles. At one point he asked, "Why didn't you pursue a concert career?" "With your talent." She looked out at the room, then back at him. "Because music isn't just for concert halls," she said. "It's for kitsch. And for schoolrooms, for broken hearts and quiet mornings. I chose to be where it's needed most." He didn't argue. He just nodded, as if finally understanding something he'd been missing for years. As the night wore on, word spread. Someone posted a short clip online, just the final minute of her Chopin, and within an hour it had thousands of views. Comments poured in, "Who is she? This is why I love classical music." She played like she'd lived every note, but she didn't see any of it. She was sitting in a quiet corner with the boy, helping him adjust the strap on his new backpack, telling him to practice slowly, to listen more than he played, to never be afraid of making mistakes. And across the room, the famous pianist watched them, a new idea forming in his mind, an idea not about competition but collaboration, about using his platform not just for himself, but for voices like hers that had been overlooked for too long. The evening ended with his scheduled encore, a dazzling performance of Liszt that would have thrilled the crowd any other night. But this time people listened differently. They heard not just technique but something deeper, because they'd been reminded that music isn't about perfection, it's about truth, and sometimes truth walks into a grand ballroom wearing a second-hand dress, sits down at a piano, and changes everything without saying a single word. The morning after the gala, Vienna woke to soft rain and a quiet hum of something new in the air. Not just the usual clatter of trams and cafe chatter, but a different kind of energy, the kind that follows when something real cuts through the noise of everyday life. In hotel rooms, apartments, and music schools across the city, people were talking about what had happened at the Palais Lobkowitz. Not the speeches, not the donations, not even the famous pianist's encore, but the woman in the simple navy dress who'd sat down at the piano and played like her heart was on fire. Videos had spread overnight. Grainy phone clips, shaky but full of feeling, showed her hands moving over the keys, the stunned faces in the crowd, the way the room seemed to hold its breath. Online, strangers debated, was she a hidden prodigy? A retired concert artist? A teacher who'd once turned down fame? No one knew for sure. But everyone agreed on one thing. She'd played with a kind of honesty that couldn't be faked. She, however, knew nothing of the buzz. She'd woken early in her modest guest room at a friend of a friend's apartment near the Prater, made a cup of weak instant coffee, and sat by the window watching the rain trace paths down the glass. Her hand still ached slightly, not from strain but from the emotional weight of the night before. Playing in front of strangers, especially after so many years of teaching in small rooms with creaky benches and out-of-tune uprights, had stirred something deep inside her. Not regret, not pride, just a quiet ache of recognition, as if she'd briefly touched a version of herself she'd set aside long ago. Her student was already up, practicing scales on a borrowed keyboard in the next room, his fingers moving with the careful concentration only children possess when they're chasing a dream. She smiled to herself. That was why she was here. Not for applause, not for validation, but for moments like this, when a child chooses to practice before breakfast because the music matters more than sleep. Meanwhile, across town, the famous pianist sat alone in his suite at a luxury hotel, staring at his phone. Dozens of messages had poured in overnight, from agents, journalists, fellow musicians. Who was she? Is she your new protege? Can we book her for our festival? He hadn't answered any of them. Instead, he'd replayed the video someone had sent him, a clear, close-up recording of her Chopin performance 3 times. Each time he heard something new, a subtle rubato in the second theme, a breath before the final cadence, the way her left hand never rushed, even in the fastest passages. It wasn't just skill, it was wisdom. He knew then what he had to do. By mid-morning, he'd made a call to the organizers of his upcoming concert at the Musikverein, one of the most revered concert halls in the world, where acoustics were said to be so perfect you could hear a pin drop from the back row. He told them he wanted to change the program, not just add an encore, not just a guest appearance. He wanted to share the stage fully, equally, and he wanted to do it for a cause. They were hesitant at first. The schedule was set. Tickets were sold. Rehearsal time was tight. But he insisted. "This isn't about me anymore," he said, voice firm but calm. "It's about showing people that greatness doesn't always wear a spotlight. Sometimes it wears a worn-out pair of shoes and teaches kids after school." After a long pause, they agreed on one condition: she had to say yes. That afternoon, he found her at a small cafe near the music academy, sitting with her student over hot chocolate and pastries. She looked up as he approached, not surprised but not entirely comfortable either. She'd seen his kind before. Charming, generous in the moment, but quick to move on to the next big thing. She wasn't sure if this was genuine or just another gesture born of guilt or curiosity. He didn't sit right away. He stood for a moment, hands in his coat pockets, raindrops glistening on his shoulders. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said. She shook her head. "He's just finishing his cocoa." The boy looked up wide-eyed, then quickly stood. "I'll go wait outside," he mumbled, already halfway to the door before she could stop him. She sighed, smiling. "He thinks you're a rock star." "I wish I were half as brave as he is," the pianist said, finally sitting down. He didn't waste time on small talk. "I've been invited to perform at the Musikverein in 6 weeks. It's a benefit concert for music education in underserved communities. The same cause as the gala." She nodded slowly, stirring her tea. "That's wonderful. I want you to perform with me." She looked up, surprised. "Me on that stage? With you?" "Yes," he said firmly. "Not as a guest. Not as a surprise, as an equal. We'll play a four-hand piece, something beautiful, something that shows how music connects people. And you'll play a solo set too. Your choice, Rachmaninoff, Chopin, whatever speaks to you." She was silent for a long time. Outside, the rain had softened to a drizzle. A street musician began playing a violin down the block, the notes floating through the open window like a gentle reminder that music was everywhere, if you listened. "I haven't performed in a proper concert hall in over 15 years, she finally said. "I teach. I correct posture. I remind kids to count their wrists. I'm not polished like you." "That's exactly why I'm asking," he replied. "Because you're not polished. You're real, and the world needs to hear that kind of music right now." She looked down at her hands, calloused in places, nails short and practical, no rings, no polish. These were hands that wiped chalkboards, carried grocery bags, held a child's hand when they were nervous before a recital. Could they belong on the same stage as his? Hands that had graced magazine covers and shaken hands with royalty? "What would I even play?" she asked quietly. "Whatever you feel," he said. "But I have a suggestion. Schubert's Fantasia in F minor for 4 hands. It's one of the most intimate, heartbreaking pieces ever written for piano. It's a conversation. Between two people, between joy and sorrow, between silence and sound. I think we could say something important with it." She knew the piece well. She'd played it once in conservatory with a dear friend who'd later moved away, and they'd never played together again. It had always stayed with her, not as a performance, but as a memory of connection. "And the solo?" she asked. "You choose," he said. "But if I may, play something that tells your story, not the notes you've mastered, but the life you've lived." She didn't answer right away, but something in his eyes told her he wasn't offering fame. He was offering partnership, respect, a chance to show the world that music isn't just for the elite. It's for everyone who dares to listen, to feel, to try. Later that week, rehearsals began, not in a grand studio, but in a quiet practice room at the music academy, lent to them by a sympathetic administrator who'd seen the videos too. At first it was awkward. They were from different worlds. He spoke in terms of tempos and dynamics. She spoke in terms of feeling and story. He wanted precision. She wanted breath. But slowly, something shifted. During one rehearsal, they stumbled over a tricky passage in the Schubert, 4 hands on one keyboard, fingers nearly colliding. He stopped, frustrated. "We need to count it out strictly." She shook her head. "No, listen. The melody here, it's like someone asking a question, and the other part, it's not answering right away. It's hesitating, because the truth is hard to say." He paused. Then he tried it her way, and suddenly the passage came alive, not as notes on a page, but as a human moment. After that, they stopped fighting the music. They started listening to each other. Word of their rehearsals spread quietly. Students would linger outside the practice room, not to gawk but to hear. Some brought their own sheet music, inspired to practice harder. Teachers began talking about the woman who played at the gala, not as a curiosity, but as a reminder of why they'd chosen to teach in the first place. Back home, her community center posted a small notice on their bulletin board. One of our own will perform at the Music Verein. No fanfare. Just pride. As the concert date neared, interviews started coming. Not just from classical music magazines, but from mainstream outlets. She declined most of them. I'm not the story, she'd say. The kids are. But she agreed to one short piece for a local radio station, on the condition that they also featured her student. During the interview, she spoke simply about how music had saved her as a child, how she'd seen it do the same for others, how a piano in a poor neighborhood could be as powerful as a library or a clinic. The famous pianist, meanwhile, used his platform differently than before. In interviews, he didn't talk about technique or repertoire. He talked about her, about the moment he realized how much he'd forgotten, the joy of playing for someone who truly listens, the humility of being moved by a stranger, the power of music to level the ground between people. Tickets for the concert sold out in 3 days. Not just because of his name, but because people wanted to see her. To witness the woman who'd turned a joke into a revelation. The night before the concert, they met one last time in the empty hall. Just the two of them, under the golden glow of the Music Verein's legendary chandeliers. They ran through the Schubert one final time, slowly, tenderly. When they finished, neither spoke. They just sat in the silence, letting the last note hang in the perfect air. Then he turned to her. Are you nervous? She smiled. A little, but not for me. For them. She nodded toward the empty seats. I hope they hear what we're trying to say. He looked out at the hall, the same hall where Brahms and Mahler had once stood, and said softly, They will. Because this time the music isn't just notes. It's a promise. And in that quiet moment, two very different lives had found the same truth, that real art isn't about being seen. It's about seeing each other. The night of the concert arrived wrapped in a hush that felt almost sacred. Rain had fallen all afternoon, washing the streets of Vienna clean, and by evening the air carried that fresh, cool scent that follows a storm, the kind that makes everything feel possible. Outside the Music Verein, people gathered early, not in flashy gowns or tuxedos alone, but in coats pulled tight against the chill, scarves wrapped snugly, eyes bright with something more than curiosity. They weren't just coming to hear famous hands on ivory keys. They were coming to witness something they'd only seen in blurry phone videos and whispered stories. The quiet woman who'd turned a moment of mockery into a revelation. Inside the hall, the usual pre-concert murmur was different. Less chatter about wine and weather. More hushed conversations about music, about teaching. About the children who might never touch a real piano if not for nights like this. Ushers moved quietly down the aisles, programs in hand. The stage stood bare except for 2 grand pianos, gleaming, patient, waiting. Backstage, in a small dressing room that smelled faintly of old wood and rosin, she sat on a folding chair, eyes closed, breathing slowly. Her dress was the same navy one from the gala, cleaned and pressed but still simple. No jewels, no designer label, just dignity. Her student sat cross-legged on the floor, tuning a small digital metronome he'd insisted on bringing for good luck. He hadn't said much since they arrived, but his presence was a steady anchor. Every now and then he'd glance up at her with that look children give when they're trying not to show how proud they are. A soft knock came at the door. The famous pianist stepped in, already in his tuxedo but without the usual air of performance. He looked tired but calm. 5 minutes, he said gently. Then he saw the boy and smiled. You ready to hear your teacher change the world again? The boy nodded, too nervous to speak. She opened her eyes. I'm not changing the world, she said softly. I'm just playing the truth. That's how you change it, he replied. They walked to the wings together, side by side, not as star and stranger, but as partners. From the stage, the audience was a sea of shadowed faces under golden light. But she didn't focus on them. She focused on the piano, on the silence before the first note, on the promise they'd made to each other in that empty hall the night before. When they stepped onto the stage, the applause began. Not thunderous, but warm, expectant, full of respect. She bowed slightly, not deeply, just enough to say thank you for being here. He did the same, then gestured for her to take the front bench. He sat beside her at the second piano. A moment of stillness. Then together, they began. The Schubert Fantasia in F minor unfolded like a conversation between two souls who'd finally found the right words. It wasn't flashy. It didn't need to be. The music lived in the spaces between the notes, the shared breath before a phrase, the way their hands never rushed each other, the quiet understanding that this wasn't about who played louder or faster, but who listened better. At one point, during a particularly tender passage, she could feel him lean into the music, not with his body, but with his spirit, and she met him there, note for note, heart for heart. When they finished, the silence lasted longer than the piece itself. No one clapped right away. They were still inside the feeling, still holding the last chord in their chests. Then slowly the applause began, soft at first, then building into something deep and resonant, the kind that doesn't just praise but honors. After a brief pause, she returned to the stage alone for her solo set. The lights dimmed slightly, focusing only on her and the piano. She didn't announce the piece. She just sat, closed her eyes, and began. She played Liszt's Consolation No. 3 Das, a piece of quiet longing, simple on the surface but rich with hidden emotion. It was the kind of music you might hear in a dream, or in the quiet hours before dawn. Her fingers moved with a tenderness that made the hall feel smaller, more intimate, as if she were playing not for hundreds but for one person at a time. Then she moved into a short original composition, something she'd written years ago for a student who'd lost a parent. It had no title, just a melody that rose like a question and settled like an answer. By the time she played the final note, many in the audience were in tears, not because the music was sad, but because it felt like home. After the concert, no one rushed out. People lingered in the aisles, talking in low voices, shaking hands, hugging. Backstage, the dressing room filled with well-wishers, musicians, teachers, even a few parents who'd brought their children to see what real music looks like. But she spent most of her time with her student, who kept tugging her sleeve and whispering, "You were amazing. You were really amazing." Later, as the crowd thinned, the famous pianist found her near the stage door, bundling up in her coat. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice quieter than usual. She turned. "What is it?" "I've been thinking a lot since the gala. About my career. About why I play. And I realized I've been playing for the wrong reasons for a long time. For applause. For reviews. For the next big haul. But last night when we rehearsed and tonight, I remembered what it feels like to play because the music matters, not because I do." She looked at him, really looked. Saw the sincerity in his eyes, the shift in his posture, the absence of the old arrogance. "That's a gift," she said. "Not everyone gets to remember that." "I want to do more than just remember," he said. "I want to act on it, and I'd like your help." He explained his idea. A foundation funded by his future performances, dedicated to bringing instruments, teachers, and opportunities to communities where music had been forgotten or deemed non-essential. Not just donations, but real presence, residencies, workshops, scholarships. And he wanted her to lead it. She was silent for a long time. Rain had started again outside, tapping gently on the roof. "I'm just a teacher," she said finally. "I don't know how to run a foundation." "You know how to change lives," he replied. "That's the only thing that matters." She thought of her students. The boy who practiced on a cardboard keyboard for months before he got a real one. The girl who'd stopped coming to class after her family lost their home. The teenager who said music was the only thing that kept him off the streets. She thought of the piano in her community center, its keys chipped, its pedals sticky but still loved. "All right," she said, "but only if it's about them. Not about us. Always about them," he promised. In the weeks that followed, the story of the concert spread far beyond Vienna. News outlets picked it up, not as a rags to riches tale, but as a quiet reminder that greatness often hides in plain sight. Schools invited her to speak. Music programs reached out for collaboration, but she stayed grounded. She flew home, returned to her classroom, and went back to correcting finger positions and celebrating small victories. Yet something had changed. Not in her, but in the world around her. Donations began arriving at her community center, anonymously at first, then with notes. Because of you, my daughter wants to learn piano. Thank you for reminding us what music is for. A local business offered to fix the old piano. A retired musician volunteered to help with lessons, and the foundation, now named the Listening Project, began to take shape. Not with grand announcements, but with small, steady steps. Their first initiative brought 10 upright pianos to schools in 3 different countries. She traveled with the team, not as a celebrity, but as a guide, showing teachers how to make music with limited resources, how to listen for the spark in a child's playing, how to nurture it without crushing it with pressure. Back in Vienna, the famous pianist began programming his concerts differently. He included pieces by overlooked composers, featured young musicians from underserved backgrounds, and always spoke about the power of listening, not just performing. Critics noticed, audiences noticed, but more importantly, children noticed. Because now when they saw a pianist on stage, they didn't just see fame, they saw possibility. One evening, months later, she received a letter from the boy, the one who'd stood by her at the gala. He was thriving at his new school, making friends, even composing his own short pieces. At the end of the letter, he'd written, "You taught me that music isn't about being perfect. It's about being honest. So I try to be honest every time I play, even when I mess up." She read it 3 times, then tucked it into the inside pocket of her teaching bag, right next to her metronome. The world would never know her name the way it knew the famous pianists, and that was fine. She didn't need it. What she needed was the sound of a child's first scale, the gasp when they finally play a chord in tune, the quiet pride in their eyes when they realize they've made something beautiful. And in that, she had everything, because the real magic wasn't in the grand halls or the viral videos. It was in the everyday moments when someone dares to sit down at a piano, not to prove anything, but to say, "I'm here. I feel, I listen, and sometimes, just sometimes, the whole world leans in to hear." 2 years had passed since that night at the Palais Lobkowitz, and the world hadn't changed overnight, but something quieter, deeper had begun to shift. It wasn't in headlines or viral trends, but in small rooms, in school basements, in community centers where pianos once gathered dust. Now those same rooms hummed with scales, laughter, and the occasional frustrated sigh when a passage refused to cooperate. And at the heart of it all was a simple idea, that music belongs to everyone, not just the chosen few. The foundation they'd started, the Listening Project, had grown in ways neither of them had imagined. It wasn't flashy. There were no celebrity galas or million-dollar billboards. Instead, it worked like roots under soil, unseen, steady, feeding something alive. They'd placed over 200 instruments in underserved schools across 3 continents. They'd trained local teachers not to mimic concert performers but to nurture curiosity, and they'd created a network where a child in Buenos Aires could share a composition with a student in Nairobi, not through competition, but through collaboration. She still taught every week. Her classroom hadn't changed much. The same worn rug, the same slightly out-of-tune upright, the same bulletin board covered in student drawings and concert tickets from tiny recitals. But now when parents asked, "Will my child become famous?" she'd smile and say, "I hope they become kind. And if music helps them with that, then we've succeeded." The famous pianist, meanwhile, had transformed in ways that surprised even himself. He still performed in grand halls, but his concerts now began with a short talk, not about the pieces, but about why music matters in hard times. He'd canceled lucrative corporate events to spend a week in a rural town, giving free lessons to kids who'd never seen a grand piano up close. Critics called it a late career reinvention. He called it coming home. Their paths crossed often, not as star and teacher, but as friends who'd been changed by the same moment. They'd meet in airports with instrument cases in tow, share coffee in backstage rooms, or sit quietly after a joint workshop, too tired to speak but full of the same quiet joy. They never spoke of the gala as a turning point. To them, it wasn't about that night. It was about everything that came after. Then came the invitation. It arrived on a Tuesday, slipped into an envelope with the seal of the Musikverein. Not for a regular concert, but for a special anniversary, a celebration of music education with performers from every program the Listening Project had touched. They wanted them both to return, to share the stage again, and this time not just as performers, but as symbols of what could happen when pride steps aside and real listening begins. She almost said no. "I'm not a symbol," she told him over a crackling phone line from her kitchen. "I'm a teacher who got lucky." "You're not a symbol," he replied gently. "But your story is. And stories help people believe change is possible." She thought about her students, the ones who now played in youth orchestras, the ones who used music to cope with grief, the ones who'd started teaching younger kids themselves. Maybe this wasn't about her. Maybe it was about showing them that their voices mattered, even if they never stepped onto a famous stage. So she said yes. The weeks before the concert were a blur of travel, rehearsals and last-minute adjustments. But this time it felt different. There was no nervousness, no pressure to prove anything, just a quiet sense of purpose. She chose her solo piece carefully, not something showy but something true. A short work by a little-known composer from her home country. A piece about resilience, about finding light after long darkness. She'd never played it publicly before, but it felt right. The night of the concert, the Musikverein was full. Not just with donors and dignitaries, but with students, teachers, parents, and community members from programs around the world. In the front row sat her original student, the boy from the gala, now taller, more confident, holding the hand of his younger sister, who'd just started piano lessons. He caught her eye as she walked on stage and gave her a small, knowing nod. "You've got this," it seemed to say. She played first. From the opening notes, the hall fell into that deep listening silence that only comes when people aren't just hearing, but feeling. Her piece wasn't long, but it carried the weight of years, the late nights grading assignments, the bus rides to lessons, the quiet joy of watching a child's face light up when they finally play a song all the way through. When she finished, there were no cheers, just a wave of quiet applause that felt more like gratitude than praise. Then came their duet, this time not Schubert, but a new arrangement they'd created together, a blend of classical structure and folk melodies from the communities they'd worked with. A lullaby from Peru, a rhythm from Senegal, a hymn from Eastern Europe. Woven together on two pianos, it became something entirely new, a musical handshake across borders, a reminder that while languages differ, the language of feeling does not. After the final chord faded, they stood together, not bowing deeply but simply turning to the audience with open hands, as if to say, like, "This is yours now." Backstage afterward, the air buzzed with joy. Students hugged. Teachers cried. A young girl from a village in Romania shyly handed her a handmade card that read, "You made me believe I could play too." She held it close, her eyes glistening. Later, as the crowd thinned and the stagehands began packing up, the famous pianist found her sitting alone on a bench near the loading dock, watching the city lights through a rain-streaked window. "Still think you're just a teacher?" he asked, sitting beside her. She smiled. "That's exactly what I am, and I wouldn't trade it for anything." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know, before that night at the gala, I thought music was about mastery, about being the best, but you showed me it's about connection, about showing up even when no one's watching. And you showed me," she said softly, "that it's never too late to change." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the distant hum of the city. Somewhere inside the hall, a student was still practicing, drawn to the piano even after the concert had ended. The sound drifted out, halting, imperfect, full of hope. "That's the real music," she said, nodding toward the sound. He listened, and for the first time in years he didn't hear mistakes. He heard possibility. In the months that followed, the listening project expanded again, not in size but in spirit. They launched a digital platform, where teachers could share lesson ideas, where students could upload recordings not for judgment, but for encouragement. They started listening circles, small gatherings where people played for each other not to impress but to be heard. She continued teaching, but now she also traveled, not as a performer but as a mentor. She'd sit with a young teacher in Manila, helping them adapt lessons for a classroom with only one keyboard. She'd listen to a teenager in Detroit play an original piece about losing a friend and say, "Keep going. The world needs to hear this." And the famous pianist? He still played in the great halls. But now, after every concert, he stayed late to answer questions, to sign programs, to listen to the stories of people who'd brought their children just to say, "See, music is for you too." Years later, When asked in an interview what had changed his life, he didn't talk about awards or recordings. He talked about a quiet woman in a simple dress who'd sat down at a piano and reminded him that music isn't about being seen, it's about seeing others. As for her, she never sought fame. She never wanted it, but her legacy grew anyway, not in headlines, but in the thousands of children who now sat at pianos with confidence, not because they were told they were special, but because someone had shown them that their voice mattered. One spring afternoon, back in her classroom, a new student, a shy girl with glasses too big for her face, hesitated before playing her first scale. "What if I get it wrong?" she whispered. The teacher knelt beside her. "There's no wrong in music," she said gently. "Only truth, and your truth is worth hearing." The girl took a breath, placed her fingers on the keys, and played. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And in that moment, in a small room far from grand stages and glittering chandeliers, the same magic that had stunned a room in Vienna lived on, not as a spectacle, but as a quiet, everyday act of courage, because real,